The scent of cinnamon and roasted almonds curled through the small bakery, but beneath the warm fragrance, there was something darker, something bitter. Nia stood behind the counter, her slender fingers kneading dough with a deliberate, almost violent rhythm. Her amber eyes, sharp and unreadable, flickered toward the small, cracked mirror that hung on the wall. She had once been beautiful. Her dark brown skin still glowed with the warmth of youth, but her once soft features had hardened into something sharper, more angular. Her full lips, once so often carved into a lover's smile, now pressed into a permanent line of displeasure. Long, intricate braids, threaded with gold beads, cascaded over her shoulders like a crown of snakes. She had been happy once. Before Jabari. Jabari had been everything to her, the sun in her sky, the fire in her blood. His laughter had been her favorite melody, his touch her only comfort. And then, like the cruel twist of a knife, he had left her. For Zalika. The name alone made her stomach churn. Zalika was everything Nia was not: delicate, soft-spoken, with skin as smooth as polished ebony and hair that tumbled in luxurious curls. She was regal, elegant, and worst of all, she had stolen Jabari's heart as if it had never belonged to Nia in the first place. Nia had begged, had wept, had cursed the gods themselves, but nothing had changed the cruel reality: Jabari had chosen Zalika, and soon, they would be married. And she, Nia, had been asked to bake the wedding cake. Oh, how she had laughed when she first heard the request. A long, hollow, humorless sound. She had spent years perfecting her craft, her bakery renowned for its delicate pastries, its rich, decadent desserts. It was almost poetic. She, the abandoned lover, would create the masterpiece that would stand at the center of their celebration. A masterpiece indeed. She had spent nights researching the right herbs, the precise dosage, the perfect combination of sweetness and death. Her kitchen became her laboratory, her oven a cauldron of vengeance. Rat poison was too crude. A simple lethal dose would be too quick. No, she wanted them to feel it, to suffer, to taste the love she had poured into every layer as it devoured them from within. The poison she crafted was exquisite. Slow-acting, just enough to lull them into a false sense of security. The symptoms would start subtly: dizziness, a slight fever, perhaps a mild discomfort. By the time they realized what was happening, it would be too late. Their insides would liquefy, their bodies convulsing in agony as their blood turned against them. Nia smiled at the thought, a wicked gleam in her eyes. She would be there, standing among the guests, watching as chaos unfurled. She could already see it, the moment Jabari reached for his throat, gasping, the way Zalika would scream, clutching her stomach, their perfect wedding turned into a banquet of death. She dusted her hands off on her apron and moved to the shelf, retrieving a small vial filled with a fine, pale powder. She held it up to the light, watching it shimmer like crushed pearls. "Sweet or bitter, my love," she whispered, tipping the vial ever so slightly. The powder cascaded into the cake batter like whispers of a curse. As she slid the cake into the oven, she closed her eyes, inhaling deeply. The flames roared to life, licking at the edges of the pan, sealing fate itself into the layers of sponge and cream. The day of reckoning was near. The grand wedding was held in the heart of the village, beneath a sprawling canopy of silk and golden lanterns. Laughter rang through the air, mingling with the melodic hum of the musicians. Guests in vibrant robes danced, their movements elegant, their voices rising in celebration. It was a vision of perfection. At the center of it all stood Jabari, his broad shoulders draped in regal gold, his dark eyes gleaming with pride. Zalika, radiant in a flowing white gown, clung to his arm, her lips painted with the softest hint of crimson. They looked every bit the part of a fairy tale couple. But Nia saw through the illusion. She stood at the banquet table, adjusting the final touches on the towering wedding cake. It was breathtaking, 3 tiers of pure artistry, adorned with delicate sugar flowers and shimmering gold leaf. The scent of vanilla and almonds drifted through the air, masking the hidden horror within. Her heart pounded as the moment arrived. A servant carried the cake to the center of the feast, placing it on a pedestal before the couple. The guests erupted into applause. Jabari and Zalika each took a knife, their hands entwined as they sliced through the first piece. Cheers filled the air as they lifted their forks, their smiles wide, their love on display for all to see. Nia held her breath. They took the first bite. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Jabari swayed, blinking in confusion. Zalika pressed a hand to her stomach, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. The first cough rang through the silence. Then another. A guest doubled over, gripping the table as his body convulsed. Someone screamed. Blood trickled from Jabari's mouth. He fell to his knees, clutching his chest, his eyes wild with terror. Nia exhaled slowly, a sinister smile curling at her lips. The feast had begun. Screams filled the air, piercing through the once joyous wedding like a dirge for the damned. The vibrant lanterns, the swaying silk banners, the golden goblets, none of it mattered anymore. Chaos had erupted, and with it, the first wave of the dying fell to the ground. The first to go was an elderly noblewoman. She had taken 2 bites of the cursed cake before her hands flew to her throat, her eyes bulging as she gasped for air. Blood spattered from her mouth in a violent cough, staining her richly embroidered robes. A second later, her frail body convulsed, then crumpled to the ground like a discarded rag doll. A servant shrieked, dropping a tray of wine as she backed away, her eyes darting from the noblewoman to the others at the table. A young man clutched his stomach, gagging, before vomiting a thick, blackened liquid. He fell face first into his plate, body twitching in its final moments. Nia stood still, drinking it all in. Jabari swayed on his feet, his strong, proud body betraying him. His dark brown skin glistened with sweat as he pressed a trembling hand to his chest. He tried to take a breath, but his lungs burned, his throat tightening as though unseen hands were strangling him. Beside him, Zalika clutched at her stomach, her delicate features contorted in agony. "And no," Zalika whispered. A thin trickle of blood dripped from her lips, and her knees buckled. Jabari tried to reach for her, but his strength failed him. He collapsed onto the table, sending goblets and plates flying. His fingers gripped the edge, nails digging into the wood as he fought against the inevitable. All around them, the guests were falling. Some clawed at their throats, their faces contorted in silent screams. Others convulsed, limbs flailing wildly before going still. The once proud nobles, the musicians, the servants, none were spared. The music had died, replaced by cries of terror, by the gurgling death rattles of the poisoned. A man stumbled forward, blood pouring from his nose, and grabbed the arm of the village elder. Help me," he begged, his voice a wet, gurgling sound. But the elder himself could barely stand. His vision swam, and he collapsed, his staff rolling from his grip. His once wise eyes were vacant, lifeless, staring at the heavens that had abandoned him. Nia exhaled softly. This was her masterpiece. The golden wedding she had been forced to watch unfold, the love she had been cast aside for, it was all drowning in blood. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the humiliation, all avenged in one perfect, poisonous moment. She stepped forward slowly, the hem of her crimson dress brushing against the blood-stained floor. Jabari turned his head toward her. His dark eyes, filled with pain and betrayal, locked onto hers. "Why you?" His voice was weak, barely a whisper. Blood dribbled from the corner of his mouth. He tried to lift a hand, but it shook violently before falling limp at his side. Nia knelt beside him, reaching out to cradle his face in her palms. Her touch was gentle, as if she were comforting a lover. "Yes," she murmured. "I did this." Jabari's breath hitched. He tried to speak again, but only a strangled choke came out. His body jerked, his muscles seizing one last time, then he was still. Zalika, barely clinging to life, let out a pitiful moan. She reached for Jabari, her fingers brushing his lifeless hand before she, too, went limp. Her once beautiful face was frozen in an expression of horror. Nia closed her eyes for a moment, as if savoring the silence that followed. The village's finest, the powerful, the happy, they were nothing but corpses now. The massacre was complete. With a satisfied sigh, Nia rose to her feet, stepping over bodies as she moved toward the shadows. The night embraced her, and without a single glance back, she disappeared. Vengeance had never tasted so sweet. The grand wedding had become a mass grave. The once bright lanterns still swayed gently in the evening breeze, casting eerie shadows over the blood-soaked banquet hall. The scent of roasted meats and spiced wine mixed with the acrid stench of vomit and death. Nia stood at a distance, hidden in the veil of darkness beyond the celebration grounds. She had slipped away effortlessly, her hands clean, her face an unreadable mask as she watched the horror unfold. Screams still echoed in the night. Those who had managed to survive the initial effects of the poison staggered through the carnage, seeking help, but there was none to be found. Some collapsed in the streets, coughing up blood, while others ran in terror, their lavish garments soaked in the lifeblood of their fallen kin. A few of the lucky ones, those who had eaten little or not yet touched the wine, gathered near the entrance, their faces pale with shock. Their hands trembled as they tried to shake the bodies of their loved ones, as if sheer will could undo what had been done. A grieving mother clutched her child's lifeless form to her chest, rocking back and forth, whispering prayers that would never be answered. A man cradled his dying wife, his own face streaked with blood, his sobs drowned out by the distant cries of the night birds. The village elders, those still breathing, had gathered at the far end of the banquet hall, their expressions a mixture of rage and horror. One of them, his wrinkled face etched with grief, turned to the remaining guards. "Find the one who did this," he rasped. "Find them, and bring me their head." A murmur of agreement rippled through the survivors. They did not know who had poisoned the feast, but they would not rest until vengeance was served. Nia smirked, unseen in the shadows. They would never find her. She had spent months perfecting her plan, ensuring that no suspicion would fall upon her. She had played her role well, the grieving ex-lover, the woman scorned, the baker who had seemingly swallowed her pride to prepare the wedding cake of her rival. No one had seen her mix the poison into the batter. No one had noticed the subtle tint to the wine. Even now, as chaos reigned, her name was not spoken with accusation. She was a ghost, a phantom of retribution. Yet, as she watched the carnage, a strange feeling settled in her chest. It was not regret, no, she had none of that. Nor was it guilt. It was emptiness. For years, she had lived with a burning hatred, an all-consuming desire for revenge. It had driven her, kept her alive, given her purpose. Now, as she stood among the ruins of the wedding that was never meant to be, she realized something. She had won. But what now? The thrill of vengeance had been sweet, intoxicating, but it had faded too quickly. The bodies lay still, the screams grew distant, and yet the rage that had sustained her for so long no longer burned. She had taken everything from Jabari. She had made him suffer. She had destroyed the woman he loved, along with everyone who had celebrated their betrayal. But she was still here. And they were gone. A soft laugh escaped her lips, quiet, hollow. Perhaps it was time to leave this place. She turned, stepping away from the burning lanterns, away from the weeping and the dead. The village would never recover from this massacre, and she had no intention of waiting to see the aftermath. The wind carried the scent of blood and omens through the air as Nia disappeared into the night, leaving only death in her wake. But fate was not finished with her yet. And neither was vengeance. The night swallowed Nia whole as she vanished into the wilderness, the cries of the dying wedding guests fading into silence behind her. She walked with steady, measured steps, the hem of her dark robes dragging against the damp earth. The weight of vengeance clung to her like an unseen spectre, but she welcomed it. She had done what she set out to do. And yet, something was wrong. The farther she went from the village, the colder the air became. A strange chill wrapped around her, unnatural in the humid night. The forest, usually alive with the hum of insects and the distant cries of nocturnal beasts, had fallen into an eerie stillness. Nia paused, her sharp amber eyes narrowing. Something was watching her. She turned slowly, her fingers instinctively curling into fists. Shadows stretched long between the towering baobab trees, but in the darkness she saw movement, figures lurking just beyond the reach of the moonlight. And then, a whisper. Low, guttural, and unearthly. She tensed, her heartbeat steady but alert. "Who's there?" she called, her voice cold, unafraid. The whispering grew louder, rising like the hiss of 1,000 serpents, wrapping around her in unseen coils. And then, from the blackness, they emerged. The dead. Bodies, broken and twisted, dragged themselves from the darkness. Blood dripped from their lips, their vacant eyes locked onto her with an unnatural, knowing hunger. Their wedding garments, once vibrant, were now tattered rags soaked in crimson. Some of them had collapsed with their mouths still open in screams they had never finished. Jabari stood among them. His once handsome face was marred with dark veins, his lips blackened by the poison that had stolen his breath. His eyes, however, burned with something beyond death, something raw, something filled with purpose. Hatred. Nia's breath came slower now, measured. "This is a trick," she murmured, her fingers tightening. "A ghost's illusion." Jabari stepped forward, his movement unnatural, his limbs jerking like a puppet on broken strings. Yet his voice, when he spoke, was clear, sharp as a blade. "No, my love," he rasped, his lips curling into something that might have once been a smile. "This is justice." The other dead took another step closer, their movements slow but relentless. Zalika was among them, her once beautiful face now frozen in the twisted agony of her final moments. Her dark eyes, lifeless and unblinking, locked onto Nia with something almost mocking. Nia's pulse quickened. This wasn't fear. She had no fear left to give. But this was something unnatural. Something beyond even her understanding. She had planned for everything. Every detail of her vengeance had been perfect. Every drop of poison had done its work. She had killed them all. So why were they here? "Did you think death would end this?" Jabari whispered. "Did you think you could take everything and simply walk away?" Nia set her jaw, a smirk ghosting over her lips despite the growing unease in her bones. "I did more than take, Jabari," she murmured, stepping forward. "I erased you." Jabari tilted his head, his blackened lips twitching. "Did you?" Nia's smirk faltered. A cold hand brushed against her shoulder. She whirled around, only to find herself face to face with one of the corpses. A man she had barely noticed at the wedding, his face bloated and ruined by the poison that had eaten him from the inside. His fingers dug into her arm, his grip far too strong for something that should not be alive. The others lunged. Nia twisted away, but hands grasped at her from all sides. Fingers clawed at her arms, her throat, her hair. The dead moved with eerie unity, their breaths rattling like dry leaves in the wind. For the first time, a flicker of panic danced in her chest. She fought. Her fists slammed into their brittle bodies, shattering bones, sending heads snapping back unnaturally. But no matter how many she broke, they did not stop. For every one she sent sprawling, two more took its place. Jabari was the last to move. He stepped forward slowly, his decayed hand reaching out, not to hurt her, not to strike her, but to take hold of her chin, forcing her to meet his ruined gaze. "You were right, Nia," he whispered, his voice like rust scraping over stone. "You erased me." His grip tightened. "But now I will erase you." Darkness surged. The forest seemed to close in on itself, the trees twisting unnaturally, the sky melting into a deep, endless black. The air around her thickened, suffocating. The world shifted, no longer earth, no longer anything but endless, swallowing night. And the dead dragged Nia down into it. She did not scream. She refused. Even as their hands pulled her into the abyss, even as her own body began to dissolve into nothingness, she did not scream. She had chosen this path. And now, it had chosen her in return. The last thing she saw was Jabari's face, watching as the darkness consumed her, as she was swallowed whole by the vengeance she had so carefully crafted. Then. Nothing. Silence. The village would speak of that night for generations to come. They would never find Nia's body. Only the ruins of the wedding, the blood-stained tables, and the lifeless corpses of those who had once celebrated. And some say, on nights when the wind howls through the trees, when the scent of almonds lingers too long in the air, you can still hear her laughter echoing from the darkness. A ghost of her own making. A curse that would never die.